Welcome back to our live team coverage here on WIS News 10. As promised, we were going to stay here at the Colleton County Courthouse until this jury reached a verdict. Greg, it took less than 3 hours. But if you step back and take a look at what we have seen transpire here over the last several weeks and look at this guilty verdict on all counts for Alec Murdaugh tonight, Greg, you cannot overlook the fact that this guilty verdict in this case came at the very courthouse where his family, his father and his grandfather created such a legacy. And you look at the tragedy of this case, the impact on this town and certainly on his family and the many victims that he has talked about in this trial. I believe that's part of the reason why the judge deferred the sentencing to tomorrow, because he said that he expects there are many people who will want to speak out regarding that sentencing. But the news tonight, this jury took very little time to decide and reach a conclusive verdict, a unanimous verdict, guilty on all charges.
In just about 3 hours, it was unanimous, it was quick, it was decisive, guilty on all counts. And an emotionless Alec Murdaugh stood to hear those verdicts. We saw tears from Alec Murdaugh at many times during this trial, but tonight there were no tears. His family was inside as well. They quickly exited the courtroom, but again, guilty on all of those charges, guilty of murder of his wife and his son in cold blood at Moselle, which is just about 30 minutes from here on the family's hunting property. And Judy, you mentioned it and set the stage here in the Colleton County Courthouse. There was a photo of his grandfather who served as the solicitor here. The Murdaugh family has presided over the 14th Circuit Solicitor's Office for close to a century. Alec Murdaugh had that solicitor's badge. He argued cases in this courtroom, and today he received a verdict of guilty. Guilty on all of those counts. Now, again, sentencing will be tomorrow at 9:30 a.m.
We have I didn't want to interrupt, Greg, but we do have the jury walking out of the courtroom. The judge has said that they are now free to speak with the media if they wish. If they don't want to speak to the media, Judge Newman said that he will certainly intervene if necessary. But he even talked, and we'll bring Carl in for some analysis as well, but Judge Newman even talked about one of these jurors, because this trial drug on for so long that the defense team had to move out of the accommodations that they made where they were going to work here for this trial, because they did not expect it to become this lengthy. But there was one juror whose job was on the line if they didn't make some special accommodation. So Judge Newman made a point tonight to thank these jurors for their service and their time and their dedication in evaluating this evidence in this case to reach this verdict tonight.
And we can't say enough about Judge Newman in many ways throughout this process and the way he handled this proceeding. Even when a juror was dismissed earlier on today, he was very cordial, thanked them for their service. He did the same tonight for the remaining jurors. But again, as they make their way out, certainly they've rendered a verdict that has shockwaves throughout not only this state, but also across the country. Yes. Many people with eyes on this trial, and they delivered a resounding verdict, guilty on all counts. Carl, it was 3 hours that they made that decision. Was their mind made up? Do you think they were swayed in any way, shape, or form during these closing arguments? We talked about this to a great degree, just how both sides were really kind of jockeying for that final argument. But the question was, did they already have a sense of where they were going with these verdicts?
Greg, I really do believe, and I've said it then and I say it now, because I remember feeling, as a defense counsel, feeling that gut punch when I found and heard out that Alex decided to testify, and then when he got on the witness stand and admitted that he lied. Once he did that, I honestly said to myself, I think that's really the end of the case. And that's why I always say you follow the advice of your attorney. Even lawyers hire lawyers because they're too close to it. And in this case, you may think you're the smartest person in the world, but that's why you hire attorneys and you follow the advice of your attorneys. But let me say, not just as a trial lawyer, but as an American, what about this wonderful American judicial system that we have here in this country, where you have the right to a jury trial, you can challenge the evidence, you can have lawyers to defend you, and that's a wonderful thing. And I just want to say that I'm happy to live in a country where at least we have those type of constitutional rights.
Well, I can hear people watching tonight saying amen in their living room. Carl, a couple of key moments that I wonder I wonder what impact they may have had on the trial. Obviously, you brought up the most obvious with him deciding to testify against his lawyer's advice, and then the audacity to get on the stand and lie to this jury, which the prosecution demonstrated about getting the blue lights added to the car. But when you move even past his testimony, what about the decision? And both sides agreed not to request a change of venue, because for the defense, I wonder if they thought, Greg, that maybe, hey, he's in his backyard. People here know this family. We have a reputation here. It will overcome these charges, as it has overcome a lot of controversy in the past. But the prosecution bet on the fact that it was time for him to pay.
That's right.
For all of this to come to bear. And everything that, all the lies that he had told to really come to bear.
Yeah. And probably betting on the fact that his name had been tainted because of all the things that he'd done and all the various victims, especially of the financial crimes as well, which was able to get into evidence. So they thought because he'd been vilified by so many incidents that occurred, maybe we won't ask for a change of venue. So I have two different thoughts on that. I was initially thinking what you mentioned, that the backyard thing, trying this case in his own backyard. But the prosecutor probably said exactly what I've talked about just now. Well, wait a minute. Yeah, he's in his own backyard, but look at all the things he's done to the various people in his own backyard. So change of venue, maybe not.
One of the big things from Creighton Waters, especially when he was making his final argument to the jury yesterday, was when he was talking about Alec Murdaugh and his pattern of lies, that he was a pathological liar in many ways, and talked to those jurors and said, don't let what happened to all of his victims happen to you. Meaning, don't let him lie to you from the witness stand. Hold him accountable for his lies. And it would appear, and you really have to give the hat tip at this time to Creighton Waters and the state's prosecution team, including the Attorney General of our state, Alan Wilson, who questioned the final witness, Ken Kenzie, the forensic analyst, and gave a pretty convincing blowback to what was the defense's biggest argument of possibly two shooters, or the possibility that the wounds came from different places. Alan Wilson sat behind his team for 5.5 weeks, and then he got up and he argued very effectively to that jury, laying out that argument to them very succinctly and guiding Kenneth Kenzie through that testimony. It spoke a lot to him, I would say, in backing up his team. And then in prime time, when it counted, he got up and delivered the goods.
He stood in the trenches. And in fact, I'll say this. Alan Wilson has great litigation skills. As a trial lawyer who's seen many, many trial lawyers, he has good trial lawyer skills. And he brought those to the table. And, of course, not on that, but he brought his political reputation to the table. When you think about it, the defense hired a veteran trial lawyer who's also a state senator. Well, the prosecution said, we'll see you a state senator and raise you the attorney general.
Yes, actually, we see the Murdaugh defense team walking out. We see Dick Harpootlian, as well as Jim Griffin. Looks like they are stopping and speaking with reporters. Our Nick Neville is roving at this time. We hope that he'll be able to get over there and possibly
hope that Nick can get
some reaction from Dick Harpootlian in the aftermath of these verdicts.
And let me give a heads up to our crew back in the newsroom, and also to Nick, because he probably is trying to track down the defense attorneys. But I've confirmed with the Attorney General's office that the Attorney General, Alan Wilson, you were just talking about his litigation skills, he will be holding a news conference here in front of the courthouse in about 20 minutes. So we hope to bring that to you live as well. Just putting the whole team on notice as I'm sharing that with you so that we can try and make that happen and bring it to you live. And Carl, as you talk about Alan Wilson, let's talk about him in just a moment, because that news conference will be coming up. But let's go back to the jury for a moment.
Yes.
Because, Greg, we had that jury dismissed this morning.
That's right.
That juror, one juror, a female juror, dismissed this morning. And Dick Harpootlian vigorously objected because he said at some point the SLED agent, remember, had interviewed this witness. Now, Judge Newman made it clear the court did not interact with SLED at all in making the decision to dismiss this juror. They interviewed this juror, found out this juror had conversations with people outside of the jury, and more importantly, had offered some sort of opinion. But I wonder, Greg, if that juror, for whatever reason, you know, they're analyzing the jury all the time and kind of trying to figure out and read the tea leaves to see which way they're leaning, and it only would have taken one. It only would have taken one. And I wonder if Dick Harpootlian thought, that was his best shot.
Yeah, I bet he did, because only one juror to create what is called a hung jury. And sometimes that happens. He probably was thinking that. And the Attorney General's office and the solicitor, I should say the Attorney General, prosecutor in this case, they thought better of it and said, well, we got to make the challenge because we found out this juror has violated the court's oath. Now, here's the point. Oftentimes, if a juror does that, the juror is not sent home. The juror is sent to jail. I know of a story where a juror's cell phone went off in the courtroom, and the judge put the juror in jail. So for a case on this magnitude, for you to violate the judge's directions and orders to not talk about things before you're supposed to, that's a serious violation. So she's fortunate that she's home tonight.
Because, Greg, even when they went out to Moselle, Judge Newman made it clear, you all are not to talk to each other out there. You are not to talk about this case. And even if jury deliberations had gone into the overnight hours where they were going to come back tomorrow to continue deliberations, he told them, you're going to have your cell phones, you'll be at home, and you'll have the typical access you would have to TV and, the internet and all of that. But he admonished them that they would not be allowed to look at news headlines. They would not be allowed to research this case. They would not be allowed to speak with anyone about the case, and certainly not to offer an opinion on it. But as you mentioned at the top of the show, this jury went in, and clearly they were of like mind to be able to reach this verdict so quickly.
There was many times throughout this trial where the defense called for a mistrial. You heard many of the analysts and pundits prior to the trial talking about that exact possibility that you just laid out, Carl, and that there might be a hung jury in this case. Many were convinced that it would be a hung jury even into closing arguments up until today. But this was resounding. It was unanimous, it was decisive, and it was swift. And so, so many of maybe the things that from the outside, especially when talking about some of the jurors' demeanor, we had heard different reporting about how the jurors were responding to some of this testimony. All of that seems to fade away quite quickly when a jury like this comes back and is able to render a verdict in such a quick fashion. So I just wanted to get your take on that, Carl. When it comes to a hung jury, it doesn't seem like that's necessarily the most probable outcome in a case like this. So as soon as you hear that there's a unanimous verdict, that almost tips the hand as to what's going to happen.
And it tells you that the jurors thought the evidence was strong, very strong. And how about the vindication of Creighton Waters by this verdict?
Yes.
He was vilified, about the crazy motive that he used. Well, now he's won the case. All right, he got the verdict. He obtained justice on behalf of the victims. So he's been vilified by this. So I think that justice has been served. And now, because I believe in the jury system. I really do believe in the jury system. And now the judge has to determine what he wants to do when it comes to sentence tomorrow morning.
We did hear from the judge. Usually, and Carl, you told this about this earlier, that typically in a murder case, sentencing would come immediately following the verdict. But because the lateness of the hour tonight, Judge Newman said he expected there will probably be a number of people who would want to participate in that hearing and provide testimony in one fashion or another. So in consideration of that, and after consulting with attorneys on both sides, they agreed that they would return at 9:30 in the morning for that sentencing hearing. We'll be able to talk with Carl about what the sentencing options are here in just a moment. But I wanted to let you know we have that live shot up of where the news conference will be held. I have confirmed with the Attorney General's office that news conference will be happening now, probably in the next 10 to 15 minutes. So we will bring that to you live when it happens. But Greg, as we talk about John Metters as well, in addition to Creighton Waters, I mean, he was the one who brought the heat, the smoke, the fire, everything today in that closing argument. In those final moments, he had to sway this jury.
The state's attorneys had received a lot of blowback at times during this trial. Creighton Waters in particular, as they talked about his meandering with some of this evidence and saying it seems so tedious and in the weeds, spending days on specific steps. And of course, all of the financial evidence that got brought into this, tracing the forensic trail of all of the money going in and out of Alec Murdaugh's accounts. And so all of this testimony took days. I mean, obviously we're on day 28 of this trial. So much of it, at least in real time, there was some real frustration and almost kind of like a collective sigh of, here he goes again with just another long sidewinder when it comes to evidence. But ultimately, all of it, it would seem, made such an incredible impact and delivered the impact clearly that the state wanted to put before that jury, that in fact there was an overwhelming amount of circumstantial evidence, some of which turned into direct evidence and ultimately incontrovertible evidence for this jury.
Yes.
Absolutely. And our Nick Neville has done a tremendous job as a part of our live team coverage here. He has his microphone in position to make sure you don't miss that news conference. So when it starts, we'll go to that news conference live again with the Attorney General giving reaction to his office winning this case, convicting Alec Murdaugh on all 4 charges that he faced, including the murders of his wife and his son. Carl, let's talk a little bit about the instructions that Judge Newman gave this jury today, because it made it clear to them, he made it clear to them that they, and they only, were the finders of facts.
That's right.
That he would not offer them beyond the instruction of the law. He would not offer them any guidance, suggestions, or opinions, that they needed to evaluate the evidence, that they should not consider themselves owing anyone any favors, that they could not consider this in terms of what they thought the law should be, but what the law is.
That's right. Normally, a jury is told you have no enemies to punish and you have no friends to reward. Your friend in this case is simply the truth. Find the truth and everybody will be happy. Maybe not the defendant in this case, but find the truth. And that's your role as a juror. And follow the instructions given by the judge. Weigh the credibility of the witnesses. Look at their demeanor. Are there any inconsistencies in their testimony? What about their credentials? All of these things go to the credibility of any witness, and the jurors make the decision as to the facts, determining the facts, and the judge is the decision maker on the law.
Just got an update from the Attorney General's office. The news conference is scheduled now to start at 8 p.m. So when it happens, we'll be ready to bring that to you live. But Greg, we've talked so much, and Carl put it best earlier, the why versus the lie, right?
Mm-hmm.
It really came down to believability.
Yep.
Ultimately, it became a test of believability, and Alec Murdaugh failed that test, clearly. So many of the witnesses in this case, you talk about what perhaps was the most compelling pieces of evidence, clearly that kennel video at 8:44 that busted Alec Murdaugh's alibi that we talked about at the top of this broadcast when we broke in to talk about a verdict. It was that kennel video that busted his alibi, showed him at the scene of the crime, placed him there when really he had said for so long that he wasn't there. And ultimately that was a big piece of evidence, but also I think some of the ballistics evidence in this was also very convincing. When they said that some of the shells that were found outside of the gun room at the Moselle property were found next to Maggie Murdaugh and that they were cycled through the same weapon, a missing .300 blackout that belonged to the Murdaughs. Again, that's a powerful piece of evidence for the jury to consider, because in order for that weapon to be used, and it was established that it was used, jurors would have to believe that maybe it was stolen and that whoever stole it then came back to the property to commit these murders. Seems like a tall task when you talk about just the logistics of how this played out. So Creighton Waters, for all of the intricacies and for all of, Paul Greer was the person who testified to this. He wasn't exactly the most exciting guy on that witness stand.
Right.
But he was able to piece that together so quickly to really kind of button up a forensic, the closest thing to direct forensic evidence in this case were those shell casings. That was very big and very key. Couple that with some of the technological evidence with the cell phone video at the kennels, as well as the Snapchat video showing him wearing a different article of clothing that was never found later. These were things I'm sure that weighed on that jury very heavily, Carl.
Absolutely.
And, when I think about the fact that Creighton stuck with his theory. Mm-hmm. All the criticism that he received, he stuck with his theory. Over and over again, he stuck with his theory. Also, imagine, if you will, how many times a person watching television said, "Not another financial crimes witness."
They sure did.
Over and over again. No, please, not another financial crimes witness. But it worked. It worked. And that prosecutor, that lawyer, has been vindicated for all of the criticism he's received from many trial lawyers that I know in many different corners. He has been vindicated.
And one other aspect we had to remind people about was that when we were listening to those, we call them trials within the trial, right?
Yeah.
When they had those hearings.
That's right.
So the viewing audience heard it ad nauseum, right?
Yes.
So by the time the jury heard it, they only heard it one time.
That's right.
So you had to kind of mentally, make that check to make sure that to have a better perspective of what the jury might have been processing and whether it felt that same way to them. But Carl, here's what we go back to with the believability, as you said earlier, the why versus the lie. It all comes back to that Snapchat video, Greg.
It does.
And when Alec Murdaugh was forced, he didn't just volunteer that he was there. He was backed in a corner and was forced to admit that was his voice on that video. But even when you dissect that, Carl, the question is, when you go back into the immediate hours following those murders, in the very first video that we saw where they entered it into evidence, where he was talking to those officers on scene, he initially said he lied because he didn't trust SLED. And then the prosecution pushed back and said, well, SLED wasn't even on the scene.
Yes.
Then he lied and said, well, it was because of my paranoia, because of the drug addiction. So they had to try and thread that needle to say, you're taking enough drugs to tell lies and to be paranoid, but not enough to be out of your mind to commit murder. And so just the believability factor in terms of trying to rehabilitate the client on the stand. As Greg said earlier, Jim Griffin had a monumental task today.
He was trying to make chicken salad with chicken feathers, and that's hard to do in a trial. I can tell you that right now. The thing about it, too, Judy, is when you think about, again, going back to what Creighton has done in this case, and his team, they had a difficult task. It's hard to win a case with just circumstantial evidence. I mean, it really is. Although the law allows you to do it, most people look for what? Where's the proof? Where's the direct evidence? You don't have a confession. You don't have a gun. You don't have an eyewitness. That's the foundation and the basis of starting off with a murder charge. You got to have solid evidence, and he did not have that in this case. But he had convincing evidence, and the most convincing evidence that he had in this case was the defendant's own words, saying he was at the scene of the crime minutes before the victims were killed, and to the exclusion of any reasonable possibility that anybody else could have come there to do so.
Yep, that's an excellent point, Carl, and we have plenty more from here outside of the courthouse in Walterboro, where a jury just convicted Alec Murdaugh of murder of his wife and his son, guilty on all charges. Plenty more coverage from here outside the courthouse as our live coverage of the Alec Murdaugh murder trial continues after this.
This was it?
WIS is supporting our veterans through United for Veterans, and you can help by signing up for the Fairways to Freedom Golf Tournament, March 20th at Cobblestone Park. United for Veterans is sponsored by Bathfitter and Palmetto State Armory.
This was it? We shouldn't have ignored that musty smell and been breathing this for so long.
I understand. Lots of people don't realize that mold feeds off moisture in their crawl space.
Moisture did all this. Well, let's cut off the cause of this mold.
The effects of water can be surprising, but at Mount Valley Foundation Services, we'll do a complete home inspection for free, so you can put water back in its place. Schedule a free home inspection today.
WIS News 10 in HD is sponsored by McWhorter, Bellinger & Associates. I'm Pat McWhorter. If you've been hurt in a car wreck, call McWhorter, Bellinger & Associates today.
Final 10 days, blockbuster sale. Fashion takes a front row seat. Rug & Home is pulling out all the stops. 70 and 20% off hundreds of rugs. Many others priced to go or on final clearance. In stock and ready to take home today. Final 10 days, blockbuster sale. Rug & Home.
Introducing Astafro Allergy, steroid-free allergy relief that starts working in 30 minutes, while other allergy sprays take hours. Now with Astapro Fast Allergy Relief, you can Astapro and go.
We're pulling out all the stops, and fashion takes the front row seat. Final 10 days, blockbuster sale. 70 plus 20% off hundreds of rugs, 0% financing, and hundreds of furniture, rugs, and accessories priced to go or on final clearance. Final 10 days, blockbuster sale. Rug & Home.
Hurt on the job? Don't take any chances. Just call Joy.
This is Alec Murdaugh at 4147 Moselle Road. I need the police to answer immediately. My wife and child have been shot badly.
This is your wife and son?
Did I kill my wife? Just no, Daddy.
It was just so bad. They did it so bad.
There's not one shred of evidence.
One question begets another, which begets another.
I go by Buster.
Do you have any idea who's done this.
Welcome back to our live team coverage. As we listened to the open there, you heard so much saying, Dick Harpootlian, we don't have one shred of evidence. Greg, clearly the jury did not agree with that tonight. Judy Gatson along with Greg Adeline. Our Nick Neville is standing by for the Attorney General's news conference. We have been told it's going to happen at 8 o'clock. As soon as it happens, we will bring it to you live. Carl B. Grant is standing by, expert analysis as a trial attorney, so he'll be weighing in momentarily. But, Greg, this really came down to believability. Yes, it was a circumstantial case, but the prosecution clearly able to connect the dots and convince this jury that there is no one else who had the opportunity, and although motive was not required, they gave this jury the questions and the answers that they were looking for in terms of why he committed these crimes.
They certainly did. And again, as we said, certainly have to tip your hat to the prosecutors in this case because they ultimately didn't have a ton of direct evidence to work with, but there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, and of course they had the defendant himself getting on the stand. Basically, his attorneys didn't want him to get up there, but he did nonetheless, and it was that move Carl describing just a moment ago that he believes was likely a fatal error in many ways, shapes, and forms, because after all, you can say things that can incriminate yourself from the stand. Different things, especially when he got drilled on that timeline.
Yes.
When they started to ask him about specific conversations that he was having with his wife at the kennels. You know, Creighton Waters was just walking him through a minute-by-minute accounting from 8:44 until 8:50. 8:50 was the time of the murders, and he was just kind of walking him through saying, well, what did you say to your wife then? When did you get up out of the golf cart and take that chicken out of the dog's mouth? All of those things, I'm certain, made such a big impression on that jury to say that, you know, because Alec Murdaugh did not have the best answers at that point. He said that, you know, he couldn't recall that final conversation. There were certain things in this case, and of course in his testimony, that he was crystal clear on.
Right.
But when it came to certain things, he just was vacant of any possible plausible answer, and ultimately that made an impression on the jury.
And I think that did make an impression on the jury, Greg, because how can you be crystal clear on every single fact that aids your defense, but be so confused and paranoid and delusional about things that might not reflect well upon you? And so that is what we heard from Alec Murdaugh on the stand, and they just didn't believe him. And Carl, one of those key moments that I have been thinking about ever since they said it during this trial, when they questioned Alec Murdaugh, what were your last words, you know, to your wife? And we talked about anybody who's lost a loved one.
Yes.
You remember the final words, the last time you saw them, you remember exactly how that played out. And he said, he paused as if he was deliberating, but said he could not remember. And I'm not saying that it's impossible that you would remember, but I think the prosecution was able to drive that point home.
You remember the details of traumatic events. And like I said earlier, when it comes to the witness's demeanor, a witness's demeanor is evidence in a case. It is evidence in a trial. And that's one of the charges that the judge gives the jury. You can evaluate the witness's demeanor. Now let's talk about Alex's demeanor in this case. His demeanor on the witness stand.
I don't mean to interrupt you. I just want to check in with our team. I can't hear in my IFB, but I see the reporters have gathered around outside of the courthouse, and I thought that I heard the Attorney General speaking in the background. So if somebody can give us a heads up and let us know if he's talking yet, we want to make sure that we hear that entire news conference when it happens. I know it's a little bit before 8 o'clock. And I'm waiting to get.
Quite yet.
Okay, great. I just wanted to be sure I saw the lines.
There.
All right, Carl. Sorry to interrupt, but we
okay.
just want to make live TV, but we want to make sure we don't miss, especially comments from the Attorney General after winning such a big case.
I was talking about Alex's demeanor on the witness stand. He's not just the defendant, but when he takes the witness stand, he is a witness, of course. He is a witness defendant. Now, let's talk about his demeanor. Apparently, and it seemed to me, his demeanor was this. I am going to show to you, Creighton Waters, that I'm a better trial lawyer than you are.
Yeah.
I'm going to match wits with you. I'm going to show you that I'm smarter than you are. I'm more persuasive than you are. And any question that you throw my way, bring it on. I'm ready. What other questions do you have of me, Mr. Waters?
Yes. What other questions do you have of me, Mr. Waters?
That's such a great point, because you saw in every single question that Alec Murdaugh, most of the questions that he was asked on that witness stand, he would ask them back to the prosecutor. So if he was asked if he was at the kennels, he'd repeat the question back. Was I at the kennels? Well, and he would then go into his answer. It seemed as though he was very deliberative, and he was answering it much like a lawyer would answer it, often parsing words and being very careful with his answers and crafted. In his direct examination with Jim Griffin, he turned directly to the jury and seemed to be playing to the jury at that time. And of course, when Creighton Waters cross-examined him, he was speaking directly to Creighton Waters. And so you just wonder if at any time, and Creighton Waters was very smart to do this, to point it out to that jury, to say, he's playing you. Don't let him play you. He's convincing. He knows how to convince a jury. He's been in a courtroom for years. He comes from a deep legal legacy. He knows how these things are done, and he knows how to convince a jury. Ultimately, I think the jury was listening to Creighton Waters.
I think they listened to him, absolutely, Greg, and they were convinced and persuaded by his argument. For those who are just joining us, Alec Murdaugh has been convicted on all 4 charges, including the murders of his wife, Maggie, and his son, Paul. Let's take a moment, listen to a brief moment in the courtroom when the judge spoke after that verdict came down.
Mr. Murdaugh, you now having been found guilty of 2 counts of murder involving your wife and your son, 2 counts of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime.
A live news conference with Attorney General Alan Wilson, who was very convincing during his participation in this trial, participating in the direct examination of some witnesses. And Carl, 2 points I want to cover with you, because in his instructions to the jury, Judge Newman made several points, but 2 that I found particularly compelling, especially in light of this verdict. He told them the believability of witnesses was very important, and that you could use that to weigh their testimony. He also pointed out the fact that expert testimony, they don't have to believe it. It's just an opinion. It doesn't carry any more weight compared to other witnesses in this case. But when we think about the expert testimony and we think about the Attorney General and his direct examination and Dr. Kinsey, because, Greg, there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, but they had 1 or 2 very compelling demonstrations in this courtroom where they demonstrated, the prosecution demonstrated the defense's theory in this case, and they really demolished it, just showing, as a matter of fact, with the logistics and how narrow the doorway was and how long the gun was, that the defense's theory of how this crime played out, in his words, was preposterous.
Yes. The arguments made by the prosecution were very, very compelling. Very compelling. And I believe that's what won the day. They themselves appeal to common sense, demonstrating, of course, number one, if you didn't do this crime, how was there enough time for somebody else to do it? Where did they come from in 3 to 5 minutes?
And where did they go?
And who shows up to commit murder and doesn't even have their own gun? Who would do that? So that's a logical point that they made, and I believe that when you weigh the credibility of the witnesses and the believability of the presentation from the other side, the jury decided the prosecution had the strong case, and it did not take them long. I said a while back in my discussions with you guys that this has really become a one-issue case now. Do you believe Alex Murdaugh or you don't? And if you don't believe him, it would be a short deliberation, and that's the conclusion the jury came to.
That is exactly what happened. You talked about some of those powerful moments, Judy. Alan Wilson picking up a Vanelli shotgun at one point and holding it over Kenneth Kinsey. Kenneth Kinsey, again, just to talk about him, was so plain spoken and was so polite, and just the way in which he handled himself on that witness stand, very convincing. He came up twice. He was a rebuttal witness. He came up even prior to that to talk about shotgun trajectories and to talk about the scene itself. And you have to wonder, that jury headed to Moselle, again, right before closing arguments. And so they were fresh off of listening to Kenneth Kinsey talk about how it all played out. And they were able to see that door frame at the feed room themselves.
Yes, they were.
They were able to compare it, and they were able to see who was telling the better version of events of what happened there. Was it a paid expert from out of state, upstate in Connecticut, or was it Kenneth Kinsey, somebody who has been on many different crime scenes, who has testified in many different trials, the credibility of the witness himself, somebody who has been involved in these cases and was able to explain it to the jury in such a way that he ultimately became a very powerful witness, and the state, you could say, was very smart to put him as their final rebuttal witness.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And the other thing I noticed about him, Carl, I'm keeping an eye on the time, 7:57. We are standing by for a news conference from the Attorney General, Alan Wilson. I assume it'll be the entire prosecution team. They have put a lot of work in this case to reach this conclusion tonight where the jury has found Alec Murdaugh guilty of all 4 charges. But, Carl, as we go back to Mr. Kinsey, Dr. Kinsey, yes, I should say, as Greg said, he was so plain spoken, but what I also noticed, and I think it may have added to his credibility with the jury, he had the same demeanor with the prosecution as he did with the defense.
He did.
His demeanor was very even. There were some witnesses who were either more aggressive or more combative, depending on who called them as a witness. But his testimony felt like it was right down the middle of the line, based on the science, and every opinion that he offered, he said, let me show you why. Let me show you why. And he explained it. You know, he's an instructor at some of our local colleges here. I'm like, now you make me want to go back to science class, because he explained it in a way where you could grasp it and understand it and try to really figure this out. And let me tell you something else. You've been here a very long time. Yeah. Let me just give you and Nick the Endurance Award, and a shout out to all of our local media. Yes. We've talked a little bit about this. There's been so much misinformation spread about this trial, but local media from top to bottom has done a tremendous job. This has been a huge story in our backyard, and I'm so proud of our team and the way that we have been able to cover that. But just in the few days that I've been down here in Walterboro, I went out last night. I actually forgot some stuff I needed in the media room, so I ended up going out. It was pretty late last night. It was after 10 o'clock. Carl, it's dark on these streets, and it is quiet.
It is.
And I'm not going to say how fast I drove down the road, but it was a 45-mile-per-hour road. And I thought about the testimony where they said he was driving 74, 80, 76 miles per hour. When I got up past 50, that felt fast on that road. Sure. Now, I wasn't on his road, so, you know, this is just like everybody going around throwing their cell phones. You see in all those videos on social media, if they had the cell phone testimony, everybody started tossing their phones trying to see, did the backlight come on and all of that. But my point is this. It is so quiet out here in Walterboro, in this quiet corner of South Carolina. I also thought about gunshots. If I heard them, if they went off, you know, in the quiet of the night. Mm-hmm. You know, I feel like the defense raised the right questions about the credibility, Carl, of what made sense.
Common sense. That's really what it's all about. If it doesn't fit with common sense, then more than likely in your life's experiences.
Yes.
Like I said earlier, when jurors come to court, and I've told them this many times in opening statement, you came here, you parked your cars, but you did not park your common sense.
Yes.
And that's what they use to come to the decisions, common sense, based upon what? Evidence. And that's how they came to the decision in this case.
Credibility and common sense were huge themes today in not only Jim Griffin's closing argument, but also in John Metter's rebuttal, saying, follow your common sense. And that was one of the things with Creighton Waters' opening statement. When you go back and listen to that opening statement, it was 33 minutes at the beginning of this trial, and he never overpromised to this jury. Everything that he said he had in this case, that the state had in this case, they introduced it, and they were able to dot I's and cross T's. They didn't make any false promises in that investigation. So let's get to that press conference right now.
You can hear the cheers behind us. Yeah.
God bless you. Don't have to come around to the side.